Hello everyone, today we talk about the strategic dimension of the Total War series and more specifically of the possibility of improving the game mechanisms to acquire a greater, say, historical accuracy in a simulative direction. I make this video because I noticed last time we talked about tactics, people got interested because, as was kind of predictable, many of you have encountered the Total War series, so on. So we'll talk essentially about Rome this time, and I'm not planning to make lots of videos about these topics, nor to play video games or all this stuff. First of all, because I don't have time anymore. Like, I've passed that phase of my life. But I confess that in last years, not so much. In fact, some years ago, let's put it in this way. As I said last time, I did work for a long time and quite intensely at a modding project that I was carrying out completely on my own, where I experimented those things that I wish I had seen being done in other Rome Total War. Again, we stick to that for today. I could speak also about medieval, for that matter, and there are two medieval too. And they're two different titles, two different game mechanics, right? But at the end of the day, they're kind of similar in practice. If anything, Roma is the easiest one to mod, and the point is that modding that has been, first of all, kind of become out-fashioned in a way, even though it's probably the single most modded title ever. And this because some limits that were put by the same game producers on the same modding, which was a real thing, especially in the latter games and titles where you can really modify a little. After all, you could, in fact, change the game in a considerable way, right? At least through the same mechanics, but implementing different dynamics that normally in the original game, for how it was calibrated, you couldn't really obtain. Why do I think this is important for Schwerpunkt, and why this is an important historical point? Well, for a number of reasons. The first one is the of course, as we saw in that video about battles, exposing what are the limitations of any kind of simulation, and of course not wasting too much time like I did trying to, well, I wouldn't really believe it could be anything like that, but trying to make it work, because at the end of the day there are better things you can do literally with history, that even with the with the satisfaction of playing a good campaign, one of these titles can never fully be the same experience, and it's somewhat time lost. Video gaming in general, at least in the way it becomes almost compulsory and let's say obsessive, becomes kind of the default way you try to release anxiety and spend hours and hours saying screw all the rest, I'll be playing this now. Many kids did it. I owe to video games a lot, honestly, also my historical passion back in the day, but I realized I spent too much time on them, so I wish I had done something else, or at least to have played video games in a much more limited and still also more qualitative way, telling the truth, because again, you really need those things. So the other reason is, in general, to show, paradoxically, in the video about battles, we've seen more or less the things that didn't quite work, in spite the game mechanics were not so bad after all. In this video, I would like to expose instead the limits that essentially modders and the broader Total War community has put on themselves because of not much lack of historical education per se, but properly the general superficiality in the relatively to the thing that could be most productive, right? That has the greatest potential of the whole game. So the campaign mechanics, that, as we will see, has been flattened fundamentally, right? Mostly in favor of graphics, right? Of graphical improvements, compared to the original game, and neglecting the mechanic dimension that, in my opinion, is instead very, very valuable and could make certain titles very, very close to at least if anything, the timing and certain broader dynamics of historical expansion of the various factions of this period between the 3rd century BC, the 1st century AD, that still have been at the center of debate, but not quite, pioneered further to a next level. And third, in fact, to show this, what I could do and what could be done, right, in the process, and launching kind of a challenge even to anybody who's interested in deepening this and testing more than else what I discovered, what I found out. There are certain things that literally even not even great fan of the series know about how those mechanics really work. And the broader issue, say, for those who do not know these games, you can go check out that video about the battles that already tells what the tactical dimension is. And speaking of the strategic dimension, the thing is simpler. Actually, there is essentially a map of the ancient world, or given we're talking about Rome, then you could be anything. There have been modifications of Rome that have that's what mod means, by the way. For those who were not in tune with the habituated to the term, also set in other historical periods, even the Napoleonic one, even the medieval one, right on Rome Total War's engine. And I advise for everybody Napoleonic 2 Total War. If you ever played that, it's fantastic. I modded it further to add a bit more of smoke on the battlefield. It was more realistic, increase some of the... There is even a campaign for Napoleonic one. But anyhow, that's yet still largely to be modified, in fact. And there is this map, and there are essentially some settlements on this map that are the cornerstones of each one of a province. The whole map is split into, right? There are 199, if I'm not wrong. And they these settlements are owned at the beginning of the campaign, so of the game that you launch, by several historical factions. So in the game, as they are set, since the original, trying to reconstruct what the actual situation in 270 BC was. So you expect the same thing: the Romans owning Italy, the Ptolemies owning Egypt and part of the Levantine coast and surrounding areas. You have the Britons in Britain. It's how you would expect the thing to be. And of course with the due approximations, because basically out of these settlements there is really nothing else, so it's all approximated in the sense that the dream of every modder would be to add more settlements, but unfortunately because of the game mechanics that's impossible. So what happens is that through an artificial intelligence that we can't really modify in its core mechanics, and this is properly the limitation of the game in many ways, which is a pretty stupid artificial intelligence, especially on the strategic map. These factions try to knock each other out, right? These factions are basically brought to grow because the settlements that are the source of income, fundamentally, are and troops, by the way, can be developed by building some structures that fundamentally give you more bonuses in economy, in troops experience and happiness and all these things. And so they grow. That's also another thing that, just if you see it like that, there is a growth that didn't exist even, by rate in the, in the modern age, given the way this settlements split up, that they increase their population and so on. And there is also a limit, by the way. So it's all very, very simple and brutal and Spartan. But part of the, what you like of that game is that it's that simple. As we will stress now, also what I like of mods is for them to be, simple, right, in their... okay, it's an oxymoron in their complexity, but let's say in general, the idea is that the face of this game should be relatively easy, because as we know as Clausewitzians, after all, war is easy, right? Let's say, or better, war is difficult, but it's easy still. What factually happens there, it's not really a matter of overwhelming complexity in the way it's managed, right? So the real difficulty is putting resources together, controlling, channeling them, commanding them, and so on. So what you do in this game is all military, right? That's where the Total War series is about. Yes, you can entertain some diplomatic relations and so on, but they're fundamentally a very light, superficial, and kind of dysfunctional and ineffective way of playing the game. Like, it doesn't change much anything, right? The artificial intelligence fundamentally goes by this logic, right? As long as you grow powerful and you have enough troops to to take over a bordering settlement, artificial intelligence will do it, right? Because of course this faction, you control one of the factions and the others go by artificial intelligence. So if there is essentially the weakest settlement, that neighboring settlement that the artificial intelligence driven ruled faction, say, spots, it's where, in spite of any other possible consideration, will be attacked, right? Which means sometimes that even smaller factions go suicidal against large empires, and large empires believe just as bullies they try to take over whatever. And it's just basically a great strong, let's say, iron arm confrontation based on the strength of the factions and how much they expand, right? And there are also some distortions in this, because first of all, this makes you understand that there is not much of a historical background to this. That is to say, politically and strategically, factions do not behave in the way ancient powers would actually do. That is to say, if the Romans expand, let's say at least some Roman factions here, I will make it simple, not to make it boring for things you do, but let's say if they they normally expand, I don't know, into Central Europe by default, right? They don't think about maybe taking over some more advantageous land. No, they just go in the underdeveloped areas for no reason, but just because that artificial intelligence takes that path, right? They don't care against whom they fight, what kind of relationships are altered. And after all, it's all very simple, because the game in the vanilla version is really it's really that simple, right? There isn't really much of an extra difficulty added to that, and the forts and so on. And it's it. And the objective is conquering the world, right? There's not even an ending point, right? You can set some objectives if you want, otherwise, it's completely free. And that's part of what this game is cool for, because there are certain mechanisms that are, that add to the randomness of this, because no campaign is really equal to another, but there are certain trends that in fact are they repeat themselves, right? No campaign will ever be equal to another, because there are so many different units that fight, so many different traits, so many different generals that are essentially the characters can, influence the government and the command, and they get traits and experience and things like that on the basis of what they go through. But so there are some random factors associated to chance, right? But still, it's a finite system. And what is, however, interesting is that, differently from other games, of course, the system is so, can differ so much, can be different at such every time that yes, for a normal human brain, this can look as if it satisfactorily simulated the complexity of such a world, even though of course it doesn't by any stretch of the imagination. It's still a deterministic game in many ways that have nothing to do with reality, that is dramatically more unpredictable. So it's that, yes, it's very simple, it's very limited in that broader picture, but still it's fun to play, because again, you can find yourself in all the time with playing the same campaign over and over again, even with the same factions. You will always find yourself in a different situation that you found yourself in before, right? So interesting, because there are certain things you just can't control that will happen, and that's why it's fun. That's what video games are technically fun for. It's the idea that there is a challenge connected to randomness that will always make things go in a different way. You want to test that kind of exposure to the unknown. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of people who started modifying this game from certain files. Now, I will not explain how it works because it's also very boring, very complicated, but it's, I mean, not even that complicated, but you have to get used to it in a sense. And that began essentially to change this game in many ways. They started changing mostly graphics. The first mods were objectively based on this, so they changed the textures of the troops to make it look in a different ways. They started changing also the skeleton, which, you know, the texture is changed, so they created different types of units and so on. There's also limited as much as like the settlements, not in the same number, but still, you know, there are, I don't remember how many units you can have, but there are several hundreds, let's say, and that's kind of interesting because, or even maybe a bit less, but because objectively they do add to the variety of the game. Like every faction objectively does have something that resembles, like, at least stereotypically, to ancient armies, right? So they tried to make it ever more accurate, and they started to create more building types that could affect the settlement. So this community grew large and wide, and they set themselves as an objective most of the times to make the game more historical. So hence the mods were born. There are many. And you can argue that almost all of them added something truly original to it that already exposed you to the, you know, to how different. I mean, when you start downloading at the beginning, you don't know anything about them. You think they're pre-packed games that will make miracles for you, right? That will show you wonders and make you solve. But they, at the end of the day, the more you play, the more of them you play, the more you realize how, after all these mods are, you understand what's the mechanic that's been, say, changed here and there, and you realize that it's not really an enormous change after all. Some of the most famous mods have naturally changed much more than the average. They have tried to give literally properly a deep historical, visual dimension to the thing. Others have implemented mostly the management, adding in fact more structures and more historical ones, and a broader objective in general through some scripts that you can use, for example, to boost some units, some factions, giving them more money on a regular basis from adding them to regular income and so on, have naturally aimed at making the game more historical also, and especially in the strategical dimension. That is to say, not just making battles more realistic, which kind of became so because, you know, the original game was a bit too quick, right? And naturally also the one that exists here, as we were explaining last time, is too quick in a sense. But something more kind of balanced. It's a very hard work because it's a lot of testing. It's a very complex system, and I don't even know how they managed to balance all the units at some point because it makes you crazy. But they also began to change the strategic dynamics and mostly the factions expansion, trying to model them on a historical pattern, right? So here there is a philosophical issue that many people did, expressed when there was a lot of forum debates on these things. That is, you know, how historical should this game be? Because obviously it's just a game, and you know that I'm very, you know, to me, I tell you, if you're searching for any kind of realism and you think you can find it in video games, in movies, you're simply delusional, right? There is no other way to put that. And I don't just say it as properly as a historian. I say it as properly somebody that loves movies, that has loved video games in general, let's say, and that knows what the limits of those things are, because most people really do not see them, right? They feel this inherent inadequacy to their understanding of the thing, but they feel hyped by those things, and they at the same time they feel anxious about the fact they don't really understand much of them. So every time you tell them, look, this is actually wrong, it doesn't even get, you know, it doesn't even try to make it something sensible, even in terms of basic logic, not just of, you know, historical accuracy. They get triggered and offended and spitting venom and all these things because, you know, paranoia and kind of properly pretending that reality is in a way that you wish it to be, and it's really not really a good recipe to approach the war, right? And and in general, many people were annoyed by these kind of searches for accuracy because they said, but it's just a video game, right? It's not, some of the points were ridiculous. Sometimes it's not a documentary, as if a documentary, by the way, was something necessarily, better in a way or worse. Like, it depends. You can't make it as if it was real history. And also, if it had to be real history, you wouldn't, essentially would like things to go only in the direction, only in the way they actually went historically, which in these games is very difficult in the first place, even by embedding the scripts with lots of scripted historical events that are also dramatically underused, by the way, in these mods, in a sense. But probably you wouldn't make it because it's just a game. There are certain mechanics that prevent you even from hoping that things can go like that. And the answer here is quite simple. That is to say, yes, we can abstract. This is like the half full or half empty glass, right? It's what does it mean? Like, at any point you could make a counter argument based on the same logic, right? The problem is the following: is that if you want to abstract a game just because it's a game from any kind of reality, then at that point, why would the creators even make a video about, in this case, about the ancient world? Right? Couldn't they make about anything else for that matter? Obviously, if they did it set in those times and spaces, it's because they, with historical factions and something that looks kind of historical, it's because they have decided there had to be standards of approximation that had to look historical in some way. Right? And mods have shown, by the way, overwhelmingly that the audience, that the public, let's say, wanted something ever more historical in that pattern. Yes, there are kind of even random or fantasy mods or things like that. Those are even fun to play. There's the random map generator creates, for example, a completely different map every time. They made a mod that fits everything. That's fine to play, because if you really don't care about, if you care about the randomness of the map, it's fascinating. Right, different factions, different climates that have nothing to do with story. Okay, but if you want to make, generally speaking, somebody playing as, I don't know, the Roman Empire or the Gallic tribes or the Seleucid Empire, whatever, you are after all trying to recreate, to simulate with all the limits of the case that kind of reality. So you cannot really go to a person and say, you can't really whine because this is not accurate enough. Right, this should open all a digression, because there is a broader criticism of this Total War series that went downhill in a way. It kind of became cheaper in terms of so much that people confused, different game mechanisms introduced, adding to the complexity of it, as if they were necessarily, in fact, going towards the right direction. They weren't. Right, it became something ever more, if you want, abstracted to what you could, in fact, even modify, given that much of these game mechanics were eventually locked by the same producers, so that you couldn't even create mods and changing as much as it was possible with, like in a title like Rome. So that's why also Rome Total War was so famous, because it created mods that were really masterpieces in terms of just the dedication, all the teams and people that worked on it. And some are very commendable, right? I guess you all know, if you are passionate of these mods, Europa Barbarorum, Roma Surrectum, should be Surrecta, two that are a bit the gold standard, right? But even behind these two mods, there are two very different philosophies that, in that sense, are interesting to analyze. Maybe I can make a video about those things too, because it's literally a different way of looking history. Like, what fascinates me of this, after all, is how is the way people think history through these things, or think history to bring for these things to be created or to be evaluated in a certain way rather than another. And they're very revealing about what people in general think about history, and I think it's very fascinating. Also, not having played them and having enjoyed them and having understood, also trying to fix them, to change them, maybe integrating some of these things, what the mechanism is. So to make it simple, there are what has, as I was saying before, bugged most people since the beginning of this campaign, is that there were some factions that would be essentially overpower. At least they would start taking over the world in a way. I mean, I believe in Rome Total War, everybody in Rome 1, everybody knows that, I don't know, the Britons usually took over the whole, Western Europe at some point. The Germans never made a headway. The Egyptians normally took over at the same time. The Valeri, Roman gens usually, was the stronger. I mean, certain things that even in their directions of expansion, it didn't make any sense, right? The game was simple. So that's why people started modding it, right? But what happened in these mods is that in spite of the fact that there was the attempt to balance the factions out, this balance has never generally been conceived, and this is the thing that I worked the most on, to make factions expanding in the same historical times and places, right, and trying to make them go through that direction. Most of this balance was created, let's say, for one faction, let's say, never to take over too quickly or too easily compared to the others, right? It was easy to do that. You could make in some script, for example, like if a faction became too large in number of settlements, you could start taking away money from the, the game goes by turns, right? So at every turn you could take money away. So basically that faction would become relatively weaker, not always, by the way, and so maybe other factions could strip away its settlements from it, and then so that malus would go away and the faction would strike back. So there would be that kind of mechanism, that kind of mechanic. And but for what concerned actually the literal geographical direction and the timing which factions would expand, in my opinion, nobody has made any real work. At least there were some scripts. You would be surprised even how much Europa Barbarorum that had a bit this kind of, even just by the title, right? Everybody is barbarian to another. This bit kind of almost relativistic idea that every faction, after all, had to have. But it turned out well, right? Every faction had to have its own background, that they would see the world through their own lenses, and so there was no center of the war, right? Not even Rome was the center of the world, differently from the initial game. It was a sensible historical, seducing historical idea, and then so that was also, in my opinion, the best mod, but not for the reasons you would normally imagine. Because at the beginning, I was also fascinated by Roma Surrectum 2 and saying, maybe it's funnier than Europa Barbarorum. Then I understood actually exactly by modding how much work there was in Europa Barbarorum, how much could be done further, but fundamentally how much more useful it was even to have a drier mod than that over flourishing Roma Surrectum 2 to with an overwhelming amount of money, troops, let's say something even too hypertrophic in a way, and nobody really centered the point. Let's say most mods and sub mods that were done of this were centered about, I don't know, creating hyper cool, ancient settlements with the real, the color and the statues, all the various, friezes and, decorations and color. Fantastic, yes. But the effort, again, to make a mod where factions would expand in kind of the right direction, tendentially, right? You see, I also have an approximation level. That is to say, this game shouldn't be about making the world literally going the way history went. The objective, the main goal, this is the point, would be to put the player in front of the same challenges that were present, historically speaking, and to try to make history going in a different direction on the base of that circumstance, which is naturally difficult to do, because if you already put the first historical event in that pattern, all history changes, so you can't really replicate exactly everything the way it did it. Otherwise you would come against history. That's again, in fact, the case of a game, right? But let's say things like even in Rome 2, like the Etruscans that take over Rome after a couple of turns, because the game is not balanced, to realize that at the time the Etruscans couldn't minimally do anything like that, is ruining the degree of plausibility of a game where you would like even to start with a world where the Romans expanded. You want to try to, to counter them, right? And instead, Rome gets immediately conquered by a C-series faction that shouldn't even be there in a sense. That's an issue, right? They started making even new titles, trying to, to fuel the delusions of, I don't know, the Spartan fanboys, or because there had to be Sparta as a meaningful faction at the time for some reason, because it's Sparta, right? And those kind of things. Again, it's not even a I added it, and I think it's, I'm not the faction, but I always represented Sparta for trying to do it for what it was, and trying even to calibrate. Not that Sparta was insignificant, but still, it shouldn't be central. Again, like in Rome 2, you can have Spartans taking over sometimes the whole map, even properly guided by artificial intelligence up to Northern Europe. What's the meaning of that? It's not intelligent, it's not beautiful, doesn't make any sense. If you want to have a random game that makes you do like that, create that. But if you expect a large audience that has manifested all these historical interests to buy that, in fact, many people, including myself, after Rome 2 said, I'm out, right? Never bought any other thing, right? By the way, not even Rome 2, because it was enough from the trailers, from looking at the ABC of game mechanics, that was not good, right? Eventually was fixed, yes, and so on, but the core dynamics in these kind of balances have never been really touched, right? And so people have been fed with the idea, but it's just a game. Well, it's not really just a game, because again, the complexity of it could produce something that can enormously stimulate intelligence, as I've seen many things, even in the modding of it, and in how to solve the problem. Instead, in most things like that, today's people are not really interested in making an effort to improve the quality of things, right? Just passively jumping from a video game to another, just as long as they get tired. Like there is no, and then you wonder why there is lack of purpose, right? It's even in these small things that you can properly understand the morals of a time. In any case, after this kind of, in fact, I don't even know how to define ramble, things like that. What I did is that at some point I began to modify the game myself with the objective of, so you understand the philosophy. So given the possibility of changing history, but still with a degree of plausibility, right? So, okay, and so I began to modify the game myself, and I started with a mod that I'm sure most of you do not know, because it's not a really necessarily B series mod. Actually, it was one of the most famous around for the connoisseur, but it was also not really. It was in another language, so I will not give too much details, because also I worked privately with the modder who authorized me to create a sub mod that eventually I never published, because it was always at a testing stage, because that's eventually how you fix the thing, and that's why I spent so much time trying to make it an interesting stuff. And I tried to toy, in fact, and then managed to obtain important results by toying with lots of, let's say, of different tools that I had at disposal, mostly the scripts, the trade system that the generals have, and the building trees. And really, especially via script, you can achieve a lot, right? Fundamentally, I grafted all the unit system of Europa Barbarorum, or almost, with some, however, historical Roman legions that are not also a huge deal, but people like to see them, and I'm even starting to think to take them away, because even in the game, you're not even going to have an artificial intelligence that uses them in an orderly way. That is, they will just create different units, different legionnaires from different legions. They will never see the full legion operationally speaking from an artificial intelligence. And even when you arrive to the point of being able to recruit your own legions, at that point, historical legions, it becomes like more this almost maniacal need to keep that legion as an entire unit, and being displeased when you mix the various cohorts with other objectives. It's not a big deal really, but it's just, I think the game is not fit for it, right? And you can save so many units, slots, and scheduling slots to actually create other units and adding to the diversity, because at the end of the day, yeah, you can have Roman legions with different shields colors and all the armor and so on, but it's still Roman legions, right? And we don't even know historically how much they varied in. I mean, we know historically that the difference actually didn't exist. That even if there were different arms and armor, that they were spread somewhat homogeneously within the various legions. There was no essential difference of what a legion was compared to another. So maybe you can content yourself or that, and adding actually different types of troops, also more ethnic ones, depending on how large you want the map geographically to be, including new cultures in the process. Whatever, that's another issue that I also didn't take too much care, because technically it doesn't change much. But the thing that I worked on for a long time was the aforementioned possibility to enact this historical development of the international situation. I didn't actually change much in tactically wise, because the Europa Barbarorum units system, in my opinion, was good. Right, there were some units that I did not include because they were not historical. Like if you show me the Carthaginians with a Macedonian phalanx, or I don't know, there are a bunch of these. It's some of the even I don't know, that there are the double-handed swordsmen from certain Celto-Germanic areas that are not documented historically, but still, I mean, they're not implausible if you really think about it, as a very elite unit that you find just every once in a while. The Europa Barbarorum team followed a very interesting philosophy that I appreciate very much, but let's say certain things I simply took away because I didn't think it were properly historical, didn't make sense. And in any case, I scripted heavily the whole game, so that's the first thing I've done, and the simply doing what essentially. Well, at this point it's all provisory. I don't even know whether I will ever finish anything of this kind. Whether I don't want to publish. I mean, I would like to at some point by satisfaction, but it would take so many years that at this point I don't have any time for any of this thing. But it could be interesting one day. I don't know. If my dream is for my future children to play with that at some point, because it would be fun to see something, in fact, more consistent, would also have an educational purpose. And most of the scripts I've inserted are actually relative to historical events. That is to say, I'm a fan of those campaigns that fundamentally evolve gradually. Right, one way to try to channel the faction expansion towards a more historical direction is also kind of making conquest more difficult, and we'll see how. So part of this has to do also with the rate of growth of the settlements and thus of the factions. This can be regulated in many ways because it can pass also through the cost of the units, things like this, and there are very delicate balances there that you have to take in consideration, such as the settlement's happiness, which is possibly, a few people know this, the most important stability factor of the game, because unfortunately there are crashes in the game as well. They don't happen often, right, but they can start happening systematically at some point for a certain game campaign balance, because of this settlement deal that fundamentally mostly than happiness. It has to do with the demographic rate. Basically, I noticed that most crashes in the game occur when settlements are going in negative growth, and I haven't figured out why this is the case. Normally that happens also when the settlements are unhappy, but at a certain point I don't know either whether it's because they rebel at some point, because when it crashes you don't know what would happen next, and so you can't even test the thing. Some crashes are seemingly irreversible. The game in fact tends to be more unstable and to crash, which means that you can't go on with the campaign. It's very frustrating because I think any player at some point with some these mods that are very complex has observed some of that. So you can't really do whatever you like in this campaign. You can modify a lot, but you have always to be aware about the parameters. So I, in a completely empirical way, managed to provide the settlements always with the degree of demographic growth and consequent happiness, because the larger the population in theory, the more difficult it is to make it happy. So I've given to the buildings kind of the right balance between normally health and happiness that makes a sustainable growth happening. Most of the problem is that when population grows, settlements have different levels of size, right? And you have to build certain structures that enable the settlements to grow to the next level. If they don't, the population will keep increasing, and consequently happiness will go down until you make it past to the next level. So that is very risky, because it produces those situations of unhappiness and negative growth when the population has overexpanded that can make the game crash. So one trick is to actually keep a minimal growth always kind of happening, and still making buildings giving enough bonuses to let's say give time to the settlements to grow slower, which is achieved sometimes by building in fact all these other structures that you added and not making the settlement passing at the next level. Why is this so important? It is important because the more the settlement grows, the more productive it becomes, which means that you have more money, mainly for the troops that are the only great expense fundamentally, that remains also always a certain level as long as the troops are available, and that bring the factions to expand. So you see there are these two forces. You don't want the settlements to grow too much, because otherwise that would unhinge the balance between factions, but at the same time you can't repress them too much, otherwise they will going negative demographic growth, and it will increase the crash, the instability of the game. So I managed to do this. Again, there is no formula. I had just to test the campaign over and over and over and over again for hundreds of turns, because it often happens that the crash can happen even 100 years later. Normally turns are 6 months long, and so you may never know how the game evolves, and you cannot control the faction's growth until you go so far in time. So needless to say, the more the settlements will always expand at some point. So there is a non-coming back point where you can't really control all the resources that are available for the factions to channel them, to stem, and or at least to address in a certain direction. So what does this mean practically? It means that, I don't know, if you play after 200 years, at some point there will surely be one of the factions that are kind of taking over half of the map, even if it's not particularly realistic. But you still want them to be certain types of factions, and therefore, given that you can control the first year's development more, you can in a sense determine more easily. It's always a matter of probability. But there is this, and it's important for history not to go always the same way, but still going towards a plausible direction in spite of all the things you can change, and doing it in a way that works. So which means that you can't simply, overpower Rome to eventually take over the whole world, because sometimes Rome will, as I was saying before, of all the direction it should take historically, that is mainly the Mediterranean for most of its history, basically until Caesar. The Roman faction will always go north of the Alps, right, conquering places like, in up to Poland, the Baltic Sea. It doesn't make any sense. And that, unfortunately, you cannot modify. That is to say, for some reason this happens, because evidently the artificial intelligence either follows the track in a way, or that there are ways also to make more or less preferable naval invasions, which I should toy also on that things, but I still have to, again, work on the buildings, on the traits, and the scripts to perfect them, even on the cost of the units, right, and the type of the units, because all these factors interfere with each other. So at some point, until you haven't set certain particular standards, you cannot know eventually. It's useless even to test the campaign, because you know that those factors may make the system go completely astray from what you thought, because they could be an important force in the process. So, you couldn't overpower Rome, for example, too much, or any other faction, if you want, for example, some other faction to survive, right? Like, I don't know, for my problem with the Romans, the campaign starts something not really in 270, but by the time of the Second Punic War, and what you want, for example, is Rome not to, I don't know, invade Gaul straight away, like in the 2nd century BC. You want the Gauls to dwell, right, and to arrive, hopefully, at 50 BC as a faction that more or less controls the whole Gaul, even if it's not really meant to be a unified power, because even here there are some approximations. Those were all tribes, right, and even if they united at some point during the Gallic Wars, it was just more nominal than practical. So the same goes for, I don't know, the Germans, the Britons, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, and all these things. But that's the approximation. And then my idea is by 58 BC, you have Caesar spawning as a character in Gaul via script, and war between Gauls and Romans set diplomatically via script. And so at that point, just the Roman invasion of Gaul in the same years, with the same ratios of force involved, for example. Well, if Rome, the artificial intelligence normally, because you want to do this not just when you play with the Romans, or even when you play with the Gauls, you actually want this to happen while you have nothing to do with both factions, because you want the game to be set independently from your action to go in that direction. That's the goal that I want. That is to say, if I play like the Dacians or like the Numidians, I want that thing to happen in historical time. And equally, there are other dynamics that now are even kind of boring to stress. That is to say, again, for example, it's the way the fronts are opened. I mean, the way troops are concentrated in a direction rather than another, and so on. The script system is quite useful, because if you have a light economy, let's say, that doesn't support much of a fast growth, it's easy, especially in the first decades, the first century of the game, to script some events that can bring to important changes. For example, the Macedonian Wars or the Syrian War, right? You want normally the Romans to win there, and the thing should be that you should make spawn 2 large armies that are fundamentally more powerful, not necessarily of what the entire, I don't know, Rome or Macedonian force are at that point, but that if you make the Roman, as it should be, the Roman army winning at Kynoskephalae or Pydna eventually, and the Romans should easily take over whatever at that point the Macedonian faction has had the capability to grow like, right? This is very important, because you should be able to make the difference, in fact, on the battlefield. You should hope to win, as if you play Macedon that way. It should be difficult also for the Roman player to win against the Macedon in that sense, because at that point history could go in a different way. But once the outcome has produced itself, that historical consequence should have that actual impact. A trick to script that, because normally if you script an army in a faraway land without any settlement controlled in a nearby, that army won't do anything, will actually try to come back home. Instead, you have to give a small settlement close to the same, bordering to the same province where the battle is going to happen, so that if the Romans, let's say, thinking still of the Macedonian Wars, right, I don't know, you give them Thessaly, and if the Romans win at Pydna, then eventually they can conquer Pella in Macedon, because it's just next door. The 2 factions are at war, so they're going to go at each other. That army is being scripted there, so you can easily make the Romans taking over the whole Macedon. You know how the mechanics works, and I actually managed to produce this. And it's quite useful, because it kind of, all the costs that these armies fundamentally that you script are are kind of subtracted to the expansion in another area of the map. That is to say, the Romans, if they have all these big armies in Macedon, eventually in Asia Minor, etc., they will expand more likely there because they have the force there rather than recruiting, I don't know, new legions in Italy and, I don't know, exceeding the boundaries going north of the Alps like the artificial intelligence would do. They will do it anyway, right? So you can also stem the advance in that case by strengthening the garrisons in Central Europe of the rebel factions that dwell there. And they're kind of a standard faction for the non-representable historical factions. They're just like 20. For example, Europa Barbarorum has that kind of script. If you notice, in Europa Barbarorum, they had probably the same problem when they were making the mod that I'm experiencing, other mods experience with the Romans invading Central Europe. And they in Europa Barbarorum, they made a great script for which basically nobody can set in Central Europe realistically coming out alive. It doesn't make much sense because it's not that Central Europe was particularly difficult to penetrate in any case, but still the game works by not seeing that kind of area which was not very profitable to invade in the first place, taken over in fact by a faction rather than another. So this channels the faction's expansion towards more historical directions, and I think that's really important. And the script is, if you want the trick, right, that's how it happens, but still it's kind of it's realistic. I scripted basically every single event, right? You don't have to script even just necessarily something that makes a faction conquering another or a battle, etc. It can be, I don't know, think about the servile revolts in Sicily, or Spartacus rebellion, or Viriatus revolt, all these things that are even just, Viriatus, that was just a pain in behind for the Romans in Lusitania. You want to replicate that, and that will oblige, I don't know, the Romans to spend more resources to fight there in the Iberian Peninsula rather than fighting somewhere else. And so you basically channel the artificial intelligence like a hook, like a bait, against those enemies, so that gradually the taking over will be complete. A very easy way to make it gradual in the expansion was traditionally also to increase the instability of the settlements. Is to say, increasing the rebellions, making it difficult for more faraway cities to be controlled and stuff. But that can also generate instability. So what you really want to do is, for example, working on the rebel type of units that can spawn every once in a while in the provinces, that again can subtract other resources. You can work on the income that a faction can have. You can even regulate that kind of treasure, that income that every year a faction has artificially via script. But there are other things you can do that have, generally speaking, not been used more than much, right? For example, there are also differences between the factions in general. For example, the Greeks, the Romans are more advanced in general. They have more technology. They have more. Simply, they come from the richer places. I tried to simulate properly the fertility of the grounds of the regions. I added some scripts that have to do with that, also with random, atmospheric, like famines or, storms, also for the Portugal Citadel, things like that. It's obvious that the Germans have it more difficult than the Romans to cash, right? But at the same time, you have to consider that it's still important for the Germans to expand, for example. So how do you do that? You increase, for example, some moral bonuses. You create, you give some bonuses for being in Germany from a political or moral point of view, but especially you create some traits that make for other factions more difficult to invade certain other places. These are the most beautiful scripts and kind of the easiest way to balance the campaign that basically nobody has ever tried. I actually took the trait from Europa Barbarorum, that is to say, every time there is a trait you can insert where if you enter in an enemy territory, you can get the trigger that enables you eventually from other negative traits to be gotten by the general. What does it mean? It means that first of all, if you're in enemy territory, the general gets less sight of vision strategically on the map. It gets a lower morale. It gets less movement points. So it means that for it's more limited in action. And so this can come from a very advanced faction, like, I don't know, Rome, etc. But if you venture in any territory, in any territory, that thing will be decreased by as for any other faction to for further expansion, which is very important because it doesn't touch any of the settlement's happiness or anything that can cause that instability. It simply brings your armies to be weaker if you're in enemy territory. And I remember always the first time I inserted the trait, there was a universal one for all the factions, all the units, because some are customized and there are different traits called because of the culture and so on. It's another thing. But I immediately perceived by launching the campaign in turn after turn that everything had kind of been more frozen, that the factions were developing, but they had greater difficulty to invade our countries because they had it less easy when they did it, and the defenders could easily take the enemy over. Plus, I inserted some traits that eventually you can hide. Some traits can be hidden. Means that when you play, you can see them, but they are there. That I use just because I know that they are there anyway, and that's a cool thing that you get a bit weighted too. But initially, there's this magic that you wouldn't like to exactly understand right when you're playing. That if you enter a settlement, because you can't, I don't know, if you enter in Gaul, let's say as an enemy territory, as a Roman, you can get that negative, that enemy territory negative, that malus. But you don't get anything connected to the type, to the fact that you're in Gaul, right? In order to do that, you have to, say, for example, conquer a Gallic settlement. Entering that settlement, if you go on with the turn, if you pass the turn, at that point, being that settlement will have given you a negative trait that is not just a random one, but is specifically designed for Gaul or for any other region. What does this mean? It can be done via script. You can do it for every settlement. It means that, as I've done, if you go into the heartland of, I don't know, of the Garamantas desert, you're going to get an enormous malus in terms of morale. I also inserted, very important, the supply trait. That is to say, if you enter an enemy territory, at some point you're supplied, but your supplies will run out, and so you have to make it quick, otherwise the enemy will take over. The same enemy suffers on the same, and only when you conquer a new territory, you enter a new settlement, you can replenish your resources, and that costs on the settlement, by the way. So that's also very important. And so this malus is increased in a place like the Sahara or Scandinavia. You don't want to enter Germany or the steppes or any other wild place where you're going to get a lot of those maluses, and when you enter, even if you're a very strong faction, you get some maluses that really do not make it impossible to conquer the place, because that's not the objective of the game either. The game should be realistic. Hell, the Romans conquered Germany and ruled it for a generation. But what you want is that you want it to be costly, so that not only you get the malus for the morale of the troops fighting there, but for example, you get less resources because that place was held. But instead, if you play as a German, you're not going to have dramatic bonuses, but you're still going to have bonuses that summed to the negative, to the maluses of the Romans. You're going to give you an edge that you can exploit to, in that sense, kick the Romans out. So I think that's which you're not necessarily going to succeed in. Actually, it's a very difficult game, by the way. And part of the reason of this is that when you play, I always played mods at very high difficulty in the strategic map as well as the tactical one. But in the larger mods, when there are more traits, more random factors, what happens is that the difficulty actually in the game is set by the game by the incidence of those traits. That is to say, if you have one chance out of 10 normally to get a positive trait, like the more you as a medium difficulty, if you make it harder, very hard, that trait will be much more difficult to be gotten. And not only, but the enemy, the other artificial intelligence ruled factions will get it more frequently. So there is actually it's like in the battles, right? You have, actually it's more difficult for you. The enemy units have a greater resistance than yours, right? If you play it very high, etc. But still you're more intelligent, so you can compensate the thing. So instead in the maps, in the strategic dimensions, sometimes it becomes ridiculous that you say there are even certain mods where you can't really play for that reason, where it's so difficult that you can't even basically win anything. For example, in Europa Barbarorum, if you play with the I think the Bactrian faction or some other of the steppes, like you get such a few amount of resources that you can't spend any more money because you go negative. And so basically you don't have any possibility to even go on with the game. Somebody will conquer you and there is literally nothing you can do, right? So it's not a matter of not knowing how to win, because at that point you can't properly win, right? It's not made on purpose, but in a sense, the difficulties which can produce that. So that's quite interesting and fascinating. So I normally play it medium on this kind of mod, especially when there are lots of traits that are all kind of this burden against you. And I play in that sense only because if it were too easy, I wouldn't play like that. What I want from the mod that I play on is that basically I have my time to dwell within my national boundaries and then to consolidate power after a lengthy struggle against the rebels. And then consolidating a little bit to move to wage the first invasions outside my own territory. It depends, right? This is normally, I don't know, maybe the Dacian campaign, right? Whereas for the Romans, yes, you already started in the 3rd century BC. You should have multiple legions at your disposal, but also you control a greater amount of territory, so you have to struggle in that sense instead. So everything has to be commensurate to it, but at the same time, the game mechanics are kind of almost equal for all. Like you can create different traits for different peoples, which I did. For example, I don't know, the Greeks and the Romans are more advanced in administration, so they get more money easily. They have more resources, but you want, I don't know, the Germans or the Gauls to be more military oriented, so for which, I don't know, they have more hit points for the general bodyguards because they're kind of in theory tougher warriors, but still they belong to a less developed civilization, so they compensate in that way. That's quite important because also, for example, the barbarians shouldn't overwhelm the world, right? It's unrealistic for that point to have, I don't know, a Central European population taking over the Mediterranean. Historically, it doesn't make fundamentally any sense because they lacked the political cohesion. They had the difficulty of, and you should simulate that. And you want to play, when you play with them, you should have the same difficulty, and that's what I've tried to give. And it has to pass, by the way, through not sitting there before you cash enough money to make an army. It should literally struggle against the rebels, against the scripted events. Hell, it's difficult when in certain situations, for example, like the Gauls, when there are the Teutonic invasions, you're kind of in the thing. It's interesting. You have these armies crossing Gaul, and those making scorched earth throughout the land, and then they border with you, so they try to invade. I mean, it's realistic, right? And at that point, if the Romans kick in with Caesar that arrives to prevent, I mean, not with Teutonic invasion, it's half century later, but before, I mean, that event. But let's say it should set still the trend for eventually that other event to happen. So that's how I have structured the whole thing. And the traits I was telling you before are very, very, very useful because it makes you realize that doesn't matter how powerful a faction is, still it should be difficult or even inconvenient for you to get, again, in a place like Germany or in Central Europe or in the steppes. Playing in the steppes is used. I made an enormous malus for everybody who enters in the steppes, whereas lots of bonuses for whoever ventures against the Scythians and the Sarmatians. They have a lot of movement points. They have, they're properly designed to intervene very quickly, to go from one place to another, but also for their cultures to be difficult to conquer permanently. I don't know, the most sedentary developed areas. Right, for example, the barbarians have a great maluses in siege capacities that give you more or less command points, more or less building points for the siege engines and all these things. Another interesting thing that I still have to test all the. I have created this; and it's very successful, but there are things I like to do. For example, the admirals. There's not much. For example, I created all a coastal navigation. Basically all the mods I've seen you can cross the sea everywhere. Instead, here there are just the coastlines, right? Or some corridor from, I don't know, one strait to another, because you want to cross, I don't know, the Romans can cross straight to Sardinia, or I don't know, you want Egypt to make it to reach Cyprus and then to reach Asia Minor, that to making all the Levantine coast tour. But still, there are a few ones. So in a way, for example, there are much more strategically significant naval battles, right? Which means that fleets are going to meet much more easily, and therefore you should also have a fleet if you want to operate to bring an army via sea somewhere, right? And so you should spend money for the fleet as well. There are also traits that are given to admirals that give more, navigating points, right? Sailing points, in order to also show what is also a bit the problem of this game, the movement points, right? For the sake of preventing quick invasions, etc., you reduce movement points, as we've seen, even when the characters enter in enemy territory. But at the same time, there's always this sense that both the generals, the armies, the admirals have a few movement points. That is to say, I don't know, in 6 months you can just go from Rome to Liguria. It's unrealistic, right? You should arrive at least to Spain. But at that point, it would be dramatically easy for any army to invade any place in the map, unless there is an impediment, like an obstacle in between. So I still have to test that and see if it is possible to implement. But it's important because it would also favor the Mediterranean invasions. So in that case, mostly for the Romans and the most advanced Mediterranean factions to kind of clash against one another, rather than Rome, as we've seen, going straight into Central Europe, where they should go starting from essentially the late Republic, the early Empire. So that's very important to me. There are other tricks you can do. I don't know, adding a foothold in, I don't know, the Britons in Gaul, simulating the Belgae, like a bit like it was in Rome Vanilla, or I don't know, simulating the Galatians by using to the Gallic faction. There are different units here. There are different factions here that are worth considering in the mod. That should also fill some gaps in the regions, etc. They are important to balance the whole thing out. But it's fascinating to see how the more you regulate the game towards this direction, how effectively factions tend to develop in the same historical direction, right? I must tell you, it's beautiful to play it, because these scripts also bring you straight there, right? For example, this game, also armies are very costly. You don't want to have too many armies around. Consider that Roma Surrectum 2 was this game where financial difficulties were very, very low, because you could always recruit easily so many troops, and at some point the savings, the campaign saving files, because of all the armies that were contained in the campaign, became so heavy that the Rome Total Wars engine couldn't upload the save anymore, so you couldn't go on with the campaign. Instead, it shouldn't be like that. It should be something more like Europa Barbarorum. That is also, however, not a game conceived for a long-term strategy, really, even though it seems like that, essentially by the 2nd century BC, even though it has, like, every turn is like a season, not really so 1/4 of a year. And not really by the 2nd century BC, like all the world is saturated. Like all the settlements have grown to the metropolis. This last stage, they are all filled with soldiers. Like there is nothing to change anymore. Another challenge of this game, as we were saying before, is making the settlement growth slower. That is to say, if you start from 200 BC, 202 from Zama, let's assume, you can arrive to Augustus times that are basically the last stage you want to do. You can do also sub-modes. I thought about that, but my game arrives up to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. And so, there are, I could go on, but at that point, it's a miracle if the campaign still goes through the historical path that it does, right? But in fact, that's the point, right? You should arrive to in how many turns are these? Basically 400 turns, something even more. still you should have, I don't know what I was saying, but I mean, you should arrive at that point hopefully with a balanced yes, with settlements that in theory have still to grow. And in 400 turns, like, you can do it if you increase the amount of buildings and the time it takes to finish them. You can do it, right? You can still arrive to a world that has to expand to settle, and so to give the impression not that it's over, right, like it is in Europa Barbarorum at some point. Roma Surrectum 2 again was conceived a bit more with this philosophy of a longer development of settlements, because it takes a lot to build so many buildings, but at the same time the factions expanded too fast because there was too much money around, and so the campaign finished earlier, not because you had finished to grow, which is good in this sense, but because, you know, it's dramatically easy in a sense to take over, or at least this happens in random ways that do not follow any historical direction. So I thought that is a very important type of modding, because it gives to the wall a comprehensive value system quality that it's not just, okay, I want to see, I don't know, a cool looking unit or a cool looking building, and yeah, lots of money for building large armies, yeah, but then eventually, you know, the campaign is not minimally balanced, and so basically you get bored because there is no point, there is no standard, there's no, like, what am I, what year is it is, like, in terms of where I should be historically, and you know, I don't, you know, I can't keep it up, right? Because that's what we attempted to do in the early days. We tried to artificially force ourselves to expand in the actual years, but it was not funny. Why? Because we were forcing the game to play our own time that it's not what you want to do in that game. And so if you instead make the game giving you randomly, without even you thinking about that when you start the campaign, the same time that you'll be given historically, that is amazing, because it like you don't feel it as an imposition, but you're actually doing it because you see that the difficulties, the impediments, the pressure, the threats, and so on, are kind of more realistic, right? These are games you should play without thinking that thing, but still that thing happening, right? For example, that the thing we were saying before, when you balance the map like this, you start kind of feeling also in your guts that it's not really profitable, I don't know, to invade a certain area rather than another, right? You should, because when you play this game over and over, you kind of get kind of a sensitivity, like, to it, because we have seen that it's like a Clausewitzian concept, right? It's a quip d'oeil, right? It's the idea that by experience, by playing, you don't really rationalize, because you see, this is a system that you cannot calculate mathematically, but you kind of know that, I don't know, if you enter the desert, it's not a good idea. That if you enter the steppe, it's not a good idea. That when you think, what's the province that I'm going to conquer next, if you can choose between, I don't know, Egypt or Germany, as, I don't know, as a Roman, well, chances are that, wow, Egypt looks dramatically, you know, open, fat, rich. It has, you know, a lot of resources, and so on. You said Germany starts becoming even a dangerous place to get in because it's covered in forests. The enemies have dramatic ambush bonuses, so that for you it's going to be difficult. It is, even you say, okay, I want to invade Germany, you do it, but you start immediately falling into ambushes that maybe fence off, but still wear out your army. So you have to come back, you have to retrain troops and say, wow, you know, those are just primitives, but still they kicked me out, and I had to repair the thing. And then maybe you get crushed, maybe you get defeated, and the Germans bring your eagles back to their own main center, and you feel horrified by this, and insulted and dishonored, and so you start associating to that region a kind of negative feeling, right? That is a bit funny, because when you play with the Germans, you can feel the same thing because you fight against other Germans constantly, but still from your own perspective, that because you're better suited as a faction to fight in that environment, and so you have it kind of easier, even if it's hard, even if it's brutal, right? And in fact, the atmosphere of this is very important. For example, Why did I choose Europa Barbarorum over Roma Surrectum 2? Most people say, Roma Surrectum 2 is better because you have all the Roman historical legions we were saying before, why I chose not to use. And because objectively, they increased a lot the availability of troops that a single faction can recruit. And now it's done in a way that I can't explain technically so easily, but let's say there are types of units and amounts of skeletons and textures that make it in Europa Barbarorum, in Roma Surrectum 2, kind of easier to have, I don't know, all factions having certain kinds of troop available when they enter in a region. In Europa Barbarorum, instead, it's like there is less diversity in the choice, but at the same time much more diversity in the characterization of the culture, and that to me is really important. That is to say, having, for example, I mean, I even understand Roma Surrectum 2, that they showed, for example, in Central Europe, between the Celtic and the Germanic areas, kind of a great promiscuity, which is even correct from a historical point of view, because you can't really distinguish easily what is a Gaul from what is a German in certain contexts, right? Even if people like to see so because they're nationalistically influenced, they think there was a sharp divide. There was. It would have been much more confusing than we think. But at the same time, it's important for a player to get that sense of realism attached also to the kind of different styles. Maybe it's about even the clothing. It's about the fact that these units do change according to the region, right? Even if they are very similar in nature as type of troopers, but they do not quite look identical. So, I don't know, if you enter in Spain, you really want to see a lot of Celtiberians there. You want to perceive the difference between the north and the south. You want to get that kind of feeling of the typology of trooper, right? So I prefer less choice of units, like in Europa Barbarorum, but that make the local area much more characteristic from an ethnic point of view, right? Even, for example, banally, I don't know, the roster of Europa Barbarorum is still very varied, right? For example, there is a lot of diversity you can choose among the many Celtic areas, or even the Iberian areas. It's plenty of different troops. But what would you do at that point is that in Gaul, you can't recruit like all those troops all together. You want still like maybe to recruit a certain type of unit only in a single type of region. I don't know, distinguishing the northern Gauls from the southern Gauls in look, even just, it's important because then you can attach it to the various characters, traits, whether they belong to a tribe or another. This is yet another thing that influences the process. There is banally, I don't know, that there are certain, I don't know, Iberian tribes that were dwelling in areas that had mineral resources. If you are one of those tribesmen in the game, you also don't just have the actual mineral resources there, but you also have a bonus in mining as a character. So that really characterizes further that specific local reality, and this makes the game much more beautiful in a sense. There are all the various wonders scattered in the game. The ones in Europa Barbarorum are really well done, in my opinion, that they add a bit more bonuses here and there, make every region a bit more special. And you want that atmosphere to be accurate, to be correct, right? And unfortunately, also, for example, the idea of scripting a battle is fundamental in a way, because one of the frustrations I was saying before also with the historical Roman legions, as I said before, is that the artificial intelligence doesn't actually chooses units on the base of their homogeneity. That is to say, paradoxically, in these games, if you want to play, I don't know, you want to fight against a Roman legion in the campaign, you basically will never find it, because the artificial intelligence in Rome will not create armies on the base of what the legions were composed by. So mostly, all heavy infantry with just a few cavalry and kind of auxiliary troops of other sort. It will just be, a blend of auxiliary troops, of city garrisons, of mercenaries. There will be a very few legionnaires after all, also because they cost. So maybe for a barbarian faction, it's kind of more realistic. Yeah, because you have all these type of warriors mixed without much, so that adds a bit to what we think of, generally speaking, more heterogeneity. But for example, if you want to fight against the Macedons or the Seleucids and having a beautiful phalanx in front of your eyes, perfectly arrayed, you will not find it likely, because they will hire all different types of troops, and the artificial intelligence won't care about having a phalanx made, right? So the scripted battle increases a lot that kind instead of experience, because finally you don't have to fight against all small armies that are not really a problem. Many people got annoyed by the fact they had to fight against small armies. That if you don't have too much income, and the factions develop orderly, they will kind of concentrate forces. But still, you want to fight a massive pitched battles with all the full characteristic unit of a faction, one against the other, and that also has the same composition of those historical battles. So in these battles, of course, you cannot really recreate via script. In campaign, unfortunately, in custom battles you can, but in campaign you can't recreate the tactics of those battles either. But still, you can fight against an army that has kind of the same composition of the one before. And it started all the battles there, and that you can imagine. And reconstructing the actual composition and so on. So you actually fight against an army that looks like, in theory, like the one you would expect from it, at least in the units typology. Then there are problems also in terms of units balance. Some are overpowered or underpowered depending on the mod. Like, for example, with Europa of Barbaronians, it's very difficult for the Romans to actually win against a Macedonian phalanx. And it's not extremely realistic in a sense, because why? Because, for example, if a phalanx is outflanked, it doesn't break immediately like it was historically speaking. So there are all considerations on the stats of the units that cannot be quite altered without altering the whole system. It's very complicated. So at that point, you want to do, like, either you increase the experience of the units in the scripted battle, or the armor, or or even the size, because some of these battles were won, for example, by the Romans even in numerical inferiority, and instead it becomes practically impossible to win a certain difficulty in that condition given the stats of the units. And sometimes, as we've seen, at very high difficulties, it's frustrating to fight against those units. So of course, if you were to play such a mod, you can choose all the difficulty that you like, but by default I go with the first of all, I want these battles to be balanced. As I said before, like all great battles, the odds are normally more balanced than in smaller battles, and so you can also make things go in a different way historically more easily, even though it should still be difficult, in fact, to turn the tides in the process. And yeah, so the traits, as I was saying before, it's in my opinion the main feature. You should have an obvious kind of advantage in a way in the more advanced factions, but also kind of environmental factors that make that, and cultural ones that favor the more primitive ones in their homelands. There should be, and it all gets down to how eventually the campaign unfolds. Right, if you start feeling the attrition that happens when you feel with the friction that happens when you play the game, you want to progress in the campaign, things start going wrong for all different factors that limit your capacity and make it more difficult. So then you know you're home. Then you know that things are going the way they're going, and technically you can do even worse than what historically happened, as you understand. So at that point, it will be difficult to reverse the tides, right? And I can assure you that it's devastating. Like when you play with the Seleucids at the Battle of Magnesia, if you lose, your empire does start falling apart in a way, because you lose access to the sea in Asia Minor, at least the most florid areas. The Romans keep pushing forward. There are other scripts. There are the Roman invasion of Galatia. There are these things that bring you to lose all a certain area that you were, a certain region that you were used to draw troops from, and your enemies will become bolder at that point. So it's all consequential, and it's very difficult to predict it in a way. But if you test and test and test, and you see, even with a minimal change, if things start going more likely in a direction, you know that you're making the right thing and you're essentially going to go right. And every faction in this way is beautiful because leaves a beautiful experience. Because I can tell you that, I don't know, unifying the Sarmatian tribes, it's really costly, right? It's really difficult even from that place to levy an adequate amount of surplus and to redistribute it in a way that is enough to start improving your own settlements, where there are rebels in the steppes that you have to cope with, and it's terrible with horse archery, with all these losses happening here and there. There are the same Scythians that you want to pressure, but they also can't strike back and all. So you start losing a lot of time just to accomplish those feats, and then it becomes kind of always more difficult the more it goes on. I mean, it shouldn't become really, it should always feel balanced, right? It shouldn't be too easy, it shouldn't be too difficult, but still maintaining the balance is the challenge of the modern. The same goes for, I don't know, I like very much the Germanic campaign. I confess that because it's somewhat frustrating, because it should be difficult to expand even beyond Germany. Just gradually you try to do it, to clash against the Celts, and then the Romans are right. It's very interesting. The same goes beautifully with some Hellenistic kingdoms, or the struggle for Carthage, the Carthaginian survival after the Second Punic War. The same unification of Spain under the Celtiberians, the Dacians that basically remain entrenched in the Carpathian basins, and they kind of fence off there, they fight against the rebels and fence off the other neighbors' ambitions. It never should go completely. It never goes completely as you would like it to go, but it's really rewarding. The Ptolemaic campaign is beautiful as well. It's very difficult to keep together all these coastal territories with the Seleucids that threaten you, with the internal rebellions, and it's fascinating. The same goes with the Parthians that gradually erode the Seleucids. It takes a while. They have to first reinforce in their homeland, etc., etc. But you get the whole thing. And by the way, there is the Roman rebel faction as well. So there are the actual civil wars taking place. So as a Roman too, which is it's the best campaign, let's be honest. It's the you gradually build your empire. At a certain point, not randomly like in Roma Surrectum 2, for example. In Europa Barbarorum didn't even have the civil wars, but you have, I don't know, the actual rebellions that happen. You start with the social war, and you start to fight in Italy in the same places that up to that point you considered like home, like literally this ferocious bloodbath that actually occurred. In even visiting, because the map is from Roma Surrectum 2, I chose, by the way, because it's very large, and so there are many places that you can roam around. Every corner is somewhat special, and I also fixed all the problems that map had. For example, Roma Surrectum 2 had this hideous coastal line, coastline that didn't have like a shore, like in the vanilla game with the waves going up. No, it's like arriving at the sea and kind of 30 meters high and then falling into the sea, and that was disgusting. I never fixed it. I fixed it. It's so beautiful. And also I flattened, like I added a bit more of depth to the relief dimension. Is to say the reliefs now are much more marked, right? The flatlands are real flatlands, and the heights are real heights. So you get this more plastic view of the world, even geographically speaking, and that is even kind of adds some strategic value, because it makes you understand better on which ground you're gonna fight tendentially, and it's not easier to even choose mountains normally. There, I created some land bridges in between Scandinavia and Jutland, for example, or the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles. So you technically, even, I mean, if it's not historical, but between Britain and Ireland, because Ireland always remained cut out and the Britons never conquered there. Instead, there also has beautiful Gaelic factions, and it's beautiful if you, I don't know, you're a Roman, you conquer Britain, you conquer the Britons, and then however there's still Ireland with a living faction in there. Yeah, this kind of things, and also more forests in places like Germany, or kind of more, yeah, I mean, even changes some climatic areas, but it doesn't matter now. But let's say always aimed at giving the kind of sensation that you would expect from that kind of environment to provide it to you. I even changed the atmospheric incidents, like now it's easier to rain, even in places like Mediterranean. You never see it raining. Why not? Right? It does rain in some places. Also, the in Gaul or Britain, it often rains for that matter, which already happened. But let's say that kind of also climate, light changing, it's important in the process. And I don't know, sometimes now, very rarely, but it can snow in the desert, which does happen, right, in some desertic areas at least. And very, 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 very rarely, but still it adds to the randomness of it, right? And so it can happen. You may at one point be surprised while you're fighting that battle, saying, look at this. I didn't expect it to go that way. And so, and on and on and on. And I guess that the result is good, because I think I got the essentials right, especially for the stability of the map, but I still have to fix a lot. Currently, I'm thinking of getting rid of the historical Roman legions to add extra, ethnic troops, let's say, from other cultures, other factions, having kind of more uniform officers, like according to the Europa Barbarorum pattern, because I used the one of Roma Surrectum too, because they used maybe more models for the same skeleton, say, so it was easier to fill more units with a type with a single slot, but it looks kind of different from the Euro. So it's important to compact everything the right way. But let's say campaign wise, I think I really made it, and currently I'm just looking at the way to slow slightly down the settlement growth without making the whole thing crashing. Everything is full of saves, of ultra saves that I'm storing at every comma that I change, for that matter. And I think at some point I could even put it out, because I think it could be instructive to see how far you can reach in that direction in a way that no other mod made it, because no other mod simulated this. No other mod picked basically every major battle of that era and kind of simulated rebellions, civil wars, and so on. It's very challenging. It's extremely difficult. It brings you to feel the necessity of reinforcing constantly, of feeling under that pressure, for which you don't just play turn after turn because you want just to make time pass and see what happens, but that presents you every turn with a completely different story you have to cope with great difficulty, by the way. And also with, however, a degree of, let's say, of realism. And also, in fact, I don't even need for each faction to be particularly diverse in types. For example, the Garamantian faction, which is, it has only one unit type, because in Europa Barbarorum it has only one unit type. You say, well, how is it possible? Well, yeah, why not? Right? Even in the primitiveness of it, of course, the Garamantians had chariots, had horsemen, and so on, but in general, right, simulating even the primitiveness of the land, there is a great deal of usefulness in showing how even such a primitive people, given that environment, can pose a threat to somebody who comes from a more civilized background, and making it happen, right? So losing in these terribly attritional battles that doesn't matter how, in fact, underdeveloped you thought these people to be, they kind of, give their life very costly, right? And on and on. And this is kind of interesting because, again, you feel that attrition, whereas when you expand in the Mediterranean, for example, you do meet with more formidable foes, especially the Hellenistic armies, of course. But at the same time, you realize that their structure is kind of, it's more articulated, more developed, more punching. But at the same time, if you hit the Schwerpunkt, they fall much more easily, right? As it actually happened. You fight against barbarian peoples, they should be relatively easy to take over, but at the same time, should be always constant guerrilla and maybe coming back and so on, because it's not about the military advancement, it's about the political and social background that makes it difficult for you to rule there in the first place, and rebellions and so on. So I believe that's the way, that's, let's say, the only true thing that at this point could satisfy me from a game, and I think that you see, I spent much more time modifying and testing rather than actually playing, which is kind of depressive, and that's part of the reason why I think I'm not going to finish this, or at least, even if I do it, it will be a very long time, and when I can't think of myself in even in a distant future without doing anything else that makes me need to work all the time. But in a sense, it does take all the time. It's necessary, right? And it's the only way you can actually make this product done. And I can tell you that the difference that it makes, because you get habituated to the game, right? But the difference that it makes when you play another mod, you say, wow, but I need to go back to that one, because that one really showed me that experience that I had always been searching in that game, and these other ones do not, right? It's not based, in fact, on exaggerations, on better graphics, or more troops, or more buildings just for the sake of it. I don't care. I want the mechanism to be historical, to go in a direction where I can say this makes sense, because I can alter the historical course, but it's not. It's plausible for the time being, and it doesn't make me feel too much the growth. Doesn't make me feel too much that of course the broader dynamics are kind of all ridiculous for a real power of the domination at that time. But still, it goes closer to what I wanted to have, right? And it's just lovely to play, I must say, because you don't even, you see, when you play, you don't even expect, even if you know historically speaking that there are certain things that are going to happen with the scripts and so on, you still try to make to work accordingly, right? To make things in time, to improve, right? As I said before, most of these games are, people give them up because it takes a lot of care, right? To administer everything correctly, to save up to the last cent, let's say. But most people don't do it because they just hope for the big battle. But if this big battle has no broader political strategical relevance, it's just for you to see the clash. Why don't you play the custom battle? And in the campaign, you should have on this battle capitalized one of the greatest amount of resources you can imagine. It could depend your whole possibility to invade a certain area should depend on that. Should depend on that outcome. And instead, that's something that you don't feel much in these mods anymore, because again the battles and the faction interaction has never meant to reflect the historical relevance that these relations had, right? These struggles that these conflicts had. So it's way more meaningful than before. If you invade Asia Minor with the Romans, with Scipio that arrives there with Lucius, you can fight against Antiochus III at Magnesia. You have to win at Magnesia, because otherwise basically the Seleucids have another dangerous army around that they prevent you to get in Asia Minor. It's not over yet, right? It's like yeah, and so it's always a threat. Instead, if you win, you open your conquest of Asia Minor, that you understand would have costed you dramatically more and in times and resources than just a scripted event that of course is going to simulate, it's not simulating, for example, the costs, right, or the recruitment ones. It's given for granted that the faction has provided for those. But then still, that army is there even in following turns if you've not defeated, and so you can take over the various Asia Minor region. And if you had done that just with your own resources, it would have taken much more time. Instead, that is happening in time, right? So it's also giving you a help in a sense, but you have to earn that help by winning the battle first. And sometimes there are just plain invasions. Yes, it does happen. Do you want to have some scripted appearances, let's say, that bring how that may tackle the strategical balance of the region, right? You don't have to underestimate some minor events either, because by the way, they all have a weight on one another, because your economy is going to suffer accordingly. So even apparently minor threats with armies that have some solid bulk, and even if they're not something except they can make you spend a lot of years, a lot of time. So before you want to take the next step, also you have to consolidate further, to pacify, to maintain a balance of the situation. This makes more time passing, more resources being spent, and so this slows down the process of growth, and so it makes things progressing with kind of more realistic speed than the vanilla one that is just, by the 2nd century BC, there are just 3 factions ruling the entire Europe and the Mediterranean and clashing. It doesn't make any sense. And I could quote lots of other anything like maybe one day we'll make a video on the various mods if you're interested. Otherwise, who cares about that? But anyhow, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.